Call it what it is, Elder Voss said, not to her, but to the assembly. A moon sickness. A defect. The pack cannot carry a female who howls alone. Mara Dunn stood in the center of the stone circle, with her hands loose at her sides and the night pressing cold against the back of her neck. She had counted 17 faces in the ring before she stopped counting, because the number didn't matter. What mattered was that Callum stood among them and had not looked at her once. She could feel him at the edge of her senses, the way she'd always felt him, a warmth that moved like sunlight through water, diffused and golden and entirely his, and she knew, from the angle of his jaw and the stillness of his shoulders, that he had made his decision before Elder Voss had finished the first sentence. 5 years. In 5 years, no other female in the pack had howled at the blood moon alone. In 5 years, the moon had risen swollen and red above the Korok Mountains, and Mara had tipped her head back and sent her voice into it, and nothing from the bond she'd believed she carried had answered. The pack said it meant the bond was false. Elder Voss said it meant she was defective. Callum, her mate, the man whose hands had cupped her face on the night of their binding with a tenderness that had felt like the whole world gathering itself into one gesture, said nothing. He said nothing, and that was the answer. The Grimwater territory begins 3 miles north, Elder Voss continued. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who considered the thing he was doing to be administrative rather than cruel. She goes at first light. She carries what she can. She does not return. Mara pressed the backs of her knuckles against her thigh to keep her hands from shaking. She would not give them shaking. She had given them 5 years of trying, 5 years of submitting herself to every reading and ritual and moon night vigil the pack elders had devised, 5 years of watching Callum's faith in her erode like river-cut stone, slowly, then all at once. She would not give them her hands shaking in the stone circle while Elder Voss read out her exile like a supply inventory. "Does she speak?" someone said from the ring, a young voice. She didn't look to find it. "She has nothing to say that changes the matter," Elder Voss replied. And Mara, for the first time in 5 years, agreed with him. She had nothing to say to any of them, but she had something to say to the dark beyond the circle's edge, to the Grimwater and whatever lived inside it, to the blood moon that had never answered her the way a bonded wolf's moon should answer. She had something to say to the 6 years ahead of her that these people believed would be her dying, because no wolf survived Grimwater territory alone, and everyone in that circle knew it. She was going to survive it anyway. She turned without being dismissed, which made Elder Voss draw breath sharply, and she walked north, toward the tree line, toward the place where the territory ended and the wild began, and she did not look back at Callum even when she felt the bond warmth flare sudden and desperate behind her, a man reaching for something his hands had already let go. She had loved Callum Ashford since the summer she was 16 and he was 19, and it had been the kind of love that felt geological, ancient, load-bearing, the sort of thing you did not choose so much as discover already formed inside you. He had found her in the birch grove at the edge of the training ground, sitting in the roots of a split tree with a book open in her lap, and he had not asked what she was doing there or told her the grove was an upper training space not open to junior pack members. He had sat down on the opposite root, folded his long legs under him, and said, "What are you reading?" That was all. "What are you reading?" But the way he said it, like he genuinely wanted to know, like she was interesting rather than inconvenient, had rearranged something in Mara's chest that never quite went back to its original position. She was reading about navigational stars. She had been teaching herself to map by them because she liked the idea of knowing where she was in the dark. She told him this, expecting him to find it strange or impress-seeking. He leaned over to look at the page, and his shoulder had touched hers, and even at 16, she had recognized that warmth, different from ordinary human warmth, deeper, more specific, the way a tuning fork recognizes its own note. "You're going to be able to go anywhere," he said, reading the star chart with the casual respect of someone who meant it. She had not known then that he was a future alpha candidate, or that the pack already watched him the way packs watch the ones they'd chosen to carry their future. She only knew that he smelled like pine resin and something cleaner beneath it, and that when he looked at her, she felt entirely present, not observed, not assessed, but seen. By the time she was 18, the pack elders were noting the bond signs, the way she always turned before he entered a room, the way his body reoriented toward her in any crowd, the mate warmth that was not romance so much as recognition, the universe adjusting its language to include them both. By the time she was 20 and he was 23, they had stood in the stone circle and been bound, and Elder Voss, younger then, less flat, still capable of something resembling feeling, had called it the strongest bond sign he'd witnessed in a generation. 1 year later, she missed her first blood moon. It was not intentional. She had been ready, had gone to the high ridge with the rest of the bonded pairs, had felt the moon rise in her blood the way it always did, heavy, insistent, pulling at some interior frequency she had never fully learned to name. She had opened her throat to howl, and the sound that came out was correct. She could hear it, clean and pitched and true. But what should have happened next? The echo from her mate, the answering call that completed the bond's circuit and told the moon the pair was whole, did not come. Callum had howled. She heard it. The pack heard it. But the moon did not close the circuit between them. The howls existed in parallel, two lines that did not meet, and when she lowered her head, Callum was looking at her with something new on his face that she had never seen there before and immediately, viscerally, did not want to see. Confusion, and under it, the first hairline crack of doubt. They told each other it was a single-year aberration. The bond was young. The moon had its own rhythms. She doubled the moon vigils, took every herb preparation the pack healer prescribed, slept with the moon windows uncovered. The second year came and went. The third, by the fourth, Callum had stopped attending the high ridge with her, and the reason he gave, pack business, alpha obligations, a scheduled meeting with the border territories, was technically true, and both of them knew that technical truth was not the only truth. What neither of them said, what lived unspoken in the space between their bodies in their shared bed, was that the pack had begun to talk about what a failed blood moon bond meant, and what it cost an alpha to carry a mate who could not complete it, and whether the binding itself might be dissolved on grounds of a defective female. The word defective had first appeared in official pack language in the third year. Mara had heard it from a council member who hadn't realized she was in the next room. By the fifth year, it was in Elder Voss's formal assessments, and Callum had begun to hold himself slightly away from her in public, a centimeter of social distance that the pack would have had to be watching carefully to notice, and which she noticed every second of every day. She had asked him once, directly, because she was not a woman who believed in dying slowly when a clean question could shorten the suffering, whether he believed she was defective. He had been quiet for 4 seconds. She counted them, standing at the kitchen window with her back to him, watching the mountain. "I believe," he said carefully, "that something isn't working." She had nodded. She had said, "I know." And she had not cried until she was alone in the birch grove, in the split root tree where he had once sat beside her and asked what she was reading, because some places absorb grief and hold it, and that place had become hers. On the 5th blood moon, Elder Voss had been present on the ridge. She had felt him watching. She had howled anyway, into the red swollen face of the moon, alone, with Callum absent, and the pack arrayed in their bonded pairs around her, like a diagram of everything she did not have. The moon had not answered. Voss had written his assessment. The assembly had been called. And Callum had stood in the stone circle and not looked at her once. She did not stop walking when the trees closed around her. The pack's territory ended at the marked stones 300 yards into the wood, ancient granite posts set at knee height, carved with the pack's boundary sigil, and she crossed them without hesitation, without ceremony, without the backward glance that exile stories were supposed to contain. The Grimwater was not a lake. It was a territory, a 6-mile tract of wetland and old-growth forest that sat between the Korok Pack's northern border and the Ashfall Mountains. No pack claimed it. Every pack avoided it. The stories ranged from plausible to impossible. Strange lights, voices in the fog, wolves that walked on 2 legs and none, the Grey Warden, an entity old enough that the pack's oldest records referenced it only as a warning. Mara had read those records. She had read everything in the pack archive that touched on Grimwater, not because she had planned for exile, but because she had grown up knowing the pack's northwest border was the only direction that scared them, and she had always been drawn to the geography of fear. She knew 3 things the elders did not know she knew. First, the lights in the Grimwater were real, but they were navigational markers, not threats. Phosphorescent moss species that bloomed in specific configurations along the safe ridge paths. She had cross-referenced the historical accounts and identified the pattern. Second, the voices were acoustic phenomena, the result of the fog channeling sound from distant sources, amplified and distorted by the particular basin shape of the wetland. Frightening, not supernatural. Third, the Grey Warden was real, and it was not a monster. It was a wolf, or had been, once, old enough to have lived before the pack boundaries existed, older than Korok's oldest elder, carrying a curse that had separated it from its own kind and bound it to the Grimwater territory as guardian and prisoner simultaneously. She had found that in a single handwritten page tucked inside the back binding of the archive's oldest record book, written in a script 2 centuries out of use. She had spent 3 months translating it, in the birch grove, alone, because it was the kind of research that required absolute solitude to respect. She had not known, when she translated it, that the information would save her life. She crossed into the Grimwater at dawn, when the phosphorescent moss was still faintly visible in the gray pre-light, and she followed the glowing ridge paths north and east, deeper than any Korok member had gone and survived to report, and on the 3rd day, the Grey Warden found her. He was tall, taller than Callum, which she noted with the observational instinct of a woman who had spent 5 years measuring herself against the shape of one man. He stood on the ridge above her with the fog moving around his legs and his gray eyes watching her with an expression that was cautious and old, the wariness of something that had been surprised by very little and trusted almost nothing. She stopped. She looked up at him. She said, "I know what you are. I'm not afraid of you." He came down from the ridge slowly, and when he was 10 feet away, he stopped, and he looked at her the way Callum had looked at her in the birch grove at 16, not assessing, not measuring, but attending, taking her in as a complete fact. "You're Korosh," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, slower, the cadence of something that had learned to speak carefully after a very long time of not needing to. "I was," she said. His name was Raeth. He had been bound to the Grimwater for 140 years by a curse laid by a river spirit he had wronged before the meaning of that word had fully formed in him, and he had spent the intervening decades making terms with his own culpability in a way that Mara found, when she began to know him, both admirable and painful to observe. He was not trying to be released from the curse, he was trying to be worthy of release, which was a different project entirely. He fed her the first night from stores he kept in a cave on the dry side of the eastern ridge, and he did not make her talk, which was the kindest thing a person had done for her in years. She ate, and the Grimwater fog moved outside the cave entrance, and the phosphorescent moss mapped the nearby paths in pale blue-green lines, and she felt, for the first time in 5 years, that she was in a place that was telling her the truth. She told him about the blood moon on the 4th day, because he asked, and because she had developed the sense that he was not asking casually. He listened to all of it, the 5 years, the ridge, the assembly, the exile, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're not defective." She had expected sympathy. The directness of the statement was not what she braced for, and it moved through her like water through a crack in stone, finding the space that had been closed for years. "You're a resonance," he continued. "It's not common. Your howl doesn't complete the circuit of an ordinary bond. It resonates differently. It requires a mate with a specific frequency to answer it. If your mate's frequency is wrong, the moon can't close the circuit. That's not your deficiency. That's his." Mara sat with that for several minutes without speaking. "The pack doesn't know that," she said finally. "Packs stopped teaching resonance theory 300 years ago. It made them uncomfortable. A resonance female is rare and powerful and requires a specific kind of mate, someone strong enough in spirit to actually meet her. Most packs prefer to say the female is broken." The bond warmth she'd always associated with Callum surfaced in her chest then, distant and aching, the feeling of a fire in a house you used to live in, visible through a window you were walking past. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, not to stop it, but to acknowledge it. "He believed them," she said. "He stood there and believed them." Wraith looked at her steadily. "Is that surprising?" And the honest answer, the one that cost something to admit, was no, it was not surprising. Callum had always been a man of the pack first, had needed the pack's faith more than he needed his own certainty. It was the quality that made him a good alpha and a limited mate, and she had spent 5 years refusing to name it, because naming it meant losing him. She named it now, sitting in the cave with the gray warden, and the blue-green light, and the grief that came with the naming was large and clean and finite. She sat inside it for as long as it needed, and Wraith did not tell her it would be all right. He simply stayed. She stayed in the Grimwater for 6 months. In those months, she learned the territory as she had once learned star charts, systematically, by direct observation, until she could navigate it in fog or darkness. She learned the language of its resident spirits, who were not hostile but were extremely particular, and who appreciated precision. She helped Raeth with the guardian work the curse required of him, walking the outer edges of the territory and maintaining the spirit agreements that kept the Grimwater from expanding beyond its natural bounds. And she learned what she was. Raeth knew the old wolf traditions, the ones that had been lost or suppressed in pack culture. He taught her to extend her howl deliberately, to direct it with intention, rather than releasing it into the open air and hoping. He taught her that a resonance female's howl could do more than complete a mate bond. It could reach the blood moon itself, in ritual alignment, and request a reckoning. The blood moon did not grant requests easily, but it answered resonance calls under specific conditions with something older than pack law. It answered them with truth. She spent 3 months learning the ritual alignment. She practiced the directional howl in the cave, where the acoustic properties were predictable, and then on the open ridge in weather, and then on the winter solstice, she stood at the highest point of the eastern ridge and sent her voice directly at the blood moon, not hoping, not asking, but stating, and the moon responded with a light that moved through her like sonar, mapping every chamber of her internal landscape, and she felt it confirm what Raitha had told her. She was not defective. She had never been defective. And the blood moon, now that she had finally spoken to it in the right language, had things to tell her about Callum Ashford that she had needed to know for 5 years. His frequency was not incompatible with hers. It was suppressed. Something had happened to him, not to her. A spiritual blockage installed with precision and clear intent. Someone in the pack had bound his resonance frequency shut, had made it impossible for him to answer her howl regardless of the bond between them. The moon showed her the shape of the binding, the signature of whoever had placed it, and she knew it immediately. Elder Voss. Not administrative, not flat professional judgment, deliberate, targeted. The elder had bound Callum's frequency because a resonance female bonded to an alpha created a power structure that the Elder Council could not fully control, and control was the architecture that Elder Voss had built his entire tenure upon. She was not defective, she had been silenced. And Callum had stood in the stone circle and signed the exile order without knowing he was signing away the woman he was made for, because someone had made sure he could never hear the truth in her howl. She stayed on the ridge until the moon moved past meridian, and then she climbed down, and Raithevs was waiting at the cave entrance, and she told him what she had seen. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going back," she said. "On their terms?" "No," she said, "on mine." She gave herself 3 more months to prepare. This was not delay, it was precision. She returned to the archive records she had memorized before exile, cross-referencing them with what Wraith knew of resonance binding, and she worked out the exact nature of Voss's binding on Callum. A spirit-sealed silencing, placed at close range, requiring only a resonance howl of sufficient directional precision to dissolve. Not a weapon, not an attack, simply the thing Voss had worked for 5 years to prevent her from doing. She was going to howl at the blood moon again, from inside Korok territory, in front of the assembly, and this time Callum was going to hear it. Wraith walked with her to the territory edge on the morning of the 6th blood moon. He stopped at the boundary markers and looked at the Korok forest beyond them. "If it doesn't go the way you've planned," he said. "It will," she said, "but if it doesn't, I know the safe paths back." He looked at her with those slow, careful gray eyes and said, "You are not the woman who came here 6 months ago." "No," she agreed. "I'm the woman who was here all along. I just had to come somewhere quiet enough to hear myself." She went alone. She reached the pack's outer training ground by midday, and she was seen before she crossed the tree line. A young border guard, she recognized him, barely 20, assigned to the northwest perimeter, raised the alarm with a voice that cracked slightly on the word intruder, which told her how little they had expected her to come back. She walked through the alarm without varying her pace. They brought her to the central ground, which was where pack business of significance was conducted, and the pack assembled the way packs did when something official was happening. Not frantic, not hostile, but arranged, present, witnessing. She counted 23 faces before Callum came through the trees, and then she stopped counting, because he was the number that mattered. He looked like 5 years had been extracted from him, rather than simply lived. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes that grief puts there differently than time does, and he held himself with the careful deliberateness of a man who had decided to be certain about everything because he could not afford another uncertainty. When he saw her, The controlled certainty fractured, just for an instant, a hairline crack in a load-bearing wall, and she felt the bond warmth surge between them, sudden and reaching. A light pushed through a door, opened for 1 second. Then Elder Voss stepped forward, and the door closed. She was exiled, Voss said. Not to her, to Callum. Even now, even here, he spoke about her as though she were not present. The exile was permanent. I know, Mara said. Voss looked at her. She had never before, in 23 years, looked directly at Elder Voss when he was speaking as an elder. It was not defiance that had stopped her. It was the accumulated weight of pack culture that said certain women, in certain positions, looked down, or sideways, or past. She looked directly at him now, steadily, the way Raeth had looked at her on the ridge the first time, attending, acknowledging, unafraid. You were told not to return, Voss said. I was told I'd be dead, Mara said. I'm not. Callum had not spoken. She could feel him across the 12 feet of open ground between them, the bond warmth that had been a comfort and a torment for 5 years, the frequency that Voss had sealed off from its proper connection. He was looking at her now, fully, the way he had not looked at her in the stone circle at the exile assembly. Something in that look was raw in a way she had no word for, the expression of a man who had made an irreversible choice and was standing in the middle of its consequences, trying to understand their shape. Callum, she said, not Alpha. His name, the way she had said it in the birch grove, in the dark of their shared room, in the years when it had belonged to her. He flinched, barely visible, only she would have caught it, because she had spent 6 years learning the exact grammar of his body. Let me howl, she said. The assembly stirred. Elder Voss's face went through several rapid iterations of control. The blood moon doesn't rise for 4 hours, Voss said. It doesn't need to be the blood moon, Mara said. That was the ceremony. This is the reality. Let me howl. Let him hear it, without whatever you put in his ears to keep him from answering. The silence that followed was the first real silence the assembly produced, not formal quiet, not arranged witnessing, genuine stillness, the kind that happens when a room understands something just shifted. Callum turned to look at Voss, not searching for guidance, searching for the expression of a man who had something to hide, and finding it. The elder's face was performing neutrality with the precise, visible effort of someone performing it, and Callum was an alpha who had spent 20 years reading the difference between genuine calm and its performance. What did you do? Callum said. The question was quiet. That kind of quiet was a specific thing in a man who was not naturally given to it. Voss said, Alpha, the female is attempting. What did you do to me? Callum said. Not a question this time. A navigation instrument, pointed. And Voss, who had spent a lifetime controlling the language of every situation he entered, had no language prepared for this exact configuration, and the absence of it was visible on his face for 4 full seconds before he assembled something, and those 4 seconds were sufficient. Mara tipped her head back and howled. She did not wait for permission. She had spent 5 years waiting for permission and 6 months in the Grimwater learning that permission was not the structure she'd believed it to be. She aimed the howl with everything Raeth had taught her, directional, intentional, precisely aimed at the specific frequency of the man 12 feet away, and the sound that came out of her was not the hoping sound of the high ridge. It was the stating sound, the truth frequency, the resonance. The pack's response was physical, a collective startle, a shifting of feet, the instinctive pack body reaction to something that read as both alarm and recognition. The bond warmth that she felt from Callum detonated. It did not flare or surge. It detonated, the the sensation of something sealed for 5 years, suddenly and completely open, every chamber of it visible, the warmth becoming light, and from him, from Callum, after 5 years of silence, an answer. It was not a rehearsed answer, or a pack culture answer, or an alpha's measured public response. It was a howl that came up through him, the way truth comes, involuntary, from the body rather than the mind, from the part of him that had known her in the birch grove before either of them had the language to name it. He was looking at her when it happened, and the expression on his face was not controlled, and it was not fractured. It was recognition, simple and complete. The moon was not at blood moon. It did not need to be. The circuit closed anyway, because the circuit had always been capable of closing. The blockage removed, the frequency unshackled, the 5 years of absence collapsed into a single point of contact. Mara felt it move through the bond connection like water following gravity. Effortless. The way things go when they are finally going the way they were always supposed to go. She lowered her head. The assembly was completely still. Elder Voss said nothing, because there was nothing that served him to say. Callum crossed the 12 feet between them. She didn't move toward him, not because she was performing dignity, but because she needed to know whether he would come to her, whether he understood that this was not a reunion in which she was required to meet him halfway. He had stood in the stone circle. He had signed the exile document with his hand. She had survived the Grimwater and learned her own name and come back with the evidence in her lungs. He came the full 12 feet. He stopped close enough that she could feel the particular warmth that was his alone, the pine and clarity of it, unchanged by 5 years, and underneath it now, something new, something she recognized as grief and its aftermath, the quality a person carries when they have finally accepted what they did. He raised one hand and stopped it before it touched her face, asking the question without asking. She stood still, which was its own kind of answer. His hand settled at her jaw, and the contact was nothing like 5 years ago, not tender in the way of two people still learning each other. It was tender in the specific way of two people who knew everything, including the worst of it, and had not found a way past it yet, but were standing in the specific territory of trying. His thumb moved across her cheekbone, one pass, and she felt the mate bond complete its circuit in her bones. Not the ceremonial circuit, the real one, the actual register of two frequencies that were made to answer each other. I believed them, he said, very quietly, for her only. I know, she said. I should have. I know what you should have done, she said. I know all of it. I've had 6 months. He absorbed this. His hand stayed at her jaw, and she let it, because the contact was not forgiveness. She was not there yet, and she was not certain she owed him a destination, but it was the first honest thing they had shared in 5 years, and honesty required at minimum acknowledgement. What do you need? He asked. It was the right question. She had rehearsed several versions of this conversation in the Grimwater, alone on the ridge, and in none of them had he asked the right question first. The fact that he did changed the temperature of something inside her. I need you to deal with Voss, she said. Formally, in front of all of them. What he did has to be named, and it has to be public, because he did it publicly. Callum lowered his hand. He turned to face the assembly, and she saw the thing she had loved about him most, the thing she'd believed lost under the erosion of the past 5 years, settle back into him, quiet and certain, the quality of a man who would not flinch from what was required. Elder Voss, he said. The flatness in his voice was nothing like Voss's professional flatness. It had gravity underneath it. In front of this pack, tell me exactly what binding you placed on your alpha, and why. Voss tried 3 approaches in rapid succession: procedural deflection, a reframing of his intentions, a suggestion that this conversation should take place in private council, and Callum refused all three with a patience that was nearly frightening in its stillness. The pack watched. The pack was made of people who had watched for 20 years as Elder Voss narrated the meaning of every pack event, and they were now watching an event that Voss did not control the narration of, and the effect of this was visible in the assembly's posture, something collective and long compressed beginning, cautiously, to release. In the end, Voss acknowledged it, not gracefully, but completely, because Callum did not accept partial acknowledgement, and because the pack was watching, and because the howl had made the truth structurally obvious to anyone with pack sense. The binding was named. The reason was named control, the fear of a resonance pair in the alpha position, the Elder Council's long investment in a structure that a powerful female threatened. The pack heard all of it. Voss was removed from the Elder Council before the blood moon rose. Mara had not asked for this specifically. She had asked for public acknowledgement, but the pack's senior healer, a woman named Doreen who had treated Mara through 3 years of moon vigil preparations and had never said anything comforting, stood in the assembly and said, with the brisk economy of someone who had been waiting for an occasion, that an elder who had deliberately sabotaged an alpha bond was an elder the pack had already outgrown. The blood moon rose at 10 past midnight. Mara went to the high ridge. She did not go alone. Callum walked beside her through the dark forest, not touching, both of them aware of the 5 years in the air between them, like weather. The pack followed at a distance, which was correct, which was how it should have been for 5 blood moons that it wasn't. At the ridge crest, with the moon enormous and red and impossibly close, he stopped beside her and turned to look at her. She could see the bond warmth in him the way she'd always felt it, but she could see it now, clearly, uncovered, the frequency unblocked and present. She could see what Voss had sealed off. She could see what had been there the entire time, unable to reach her. "I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight," he said. "Good," she said. "Tonight is for something else." She howled. And Callum Ashford, alpha of the Korok pack, the man who had sat beside her in a birch grove when they were young and asked what she was reading, who had pressed his hands to her face on their binding night with the tenderness of someone who understood that they were carrying something rare, who had stood in a stone circle and not looked at her, and who had spent 5 years in the consequence of that, answered. The moon received them both. She felt the circuit complete in a way the ritual years had never produced. Not ceremonial, not constructed, but the original architecture, the fundamental design. Whatever she was, resonance, rarity, defect, threat, the moon recognized her. It had always recognized her. The pack below the ridge heard the paired howl, and something moved through them, pack-wide, the specific shiver of a thing settling into its correct position. When the howl faded, the night was very quiet. The blood moon sat at meridian, doing what it had always done, regardless of whether the pack's politics had aligned with its nature. Callum stood close enough now that his arm was against hers. He did not move to close the remaining distance. She felt in him the understanding that the remaining distance was hers to cross or not, and she respected him more for the stillness of it than she had respected the tenderness of 5 years ago. That tenderness had been real. This restraint was harder earned. She thought about the Grimwater. She thought about Wraith in the cave entrance, the old guardian saying she was not the woman who had come there 6 months ago. She thought about what it had cost her to translate an old record in a birch grove alone, to howl at 5 blood moons without answer, to cross into territory that was supposed to kill her and find, instead, 6 months of learning who she actually was. She thought about whether any of that had required Callum's failure and what she did with the answer to that. She turned slightly, so her shoulder rested against his. He went still, the way he always went still when she touched him. Completely. A man who did not take contact casually. She felt his breath shift. "We don't start tonight where we left off," she said. "No," he agreed. "We start where we are." He looked at her in the red moonlight, and his face had the expression she'd last seen in the birch grove, on a boy who didn't know yet what he was looking at, and was paying full attention anyway. The grief was still there too, the lines of it, and she was not going to pretend those lines weren't honest. But underneath the grief, restored, the frequency she had always felt in him, the particular warmth that moved like sunlight through water, diffused and golden, entirely his. She let herself lean into it, not all the way, not yet, but enough to mean something. "I went to the Grimwater," she said. "I know," he said. "The Border Patrol reported the direction. I found someone there." He was quiet for a moment. "The Grey Warden. He taught me what I am." Callum closed his eyes briefly, and she understood what that meant. The grief of knowing that someone else had given her what he'd been supposed to give her, what he'd failed to protect her right to know. When he opened them, he looked at the moon rather than at her. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. All of it. Rayeth, the resonance theory, the 3 months of learning the directional howl, the solstice ritual, and what the moon had shown her. She told him about Voss's binding, the signature she'd recognized, the shape of what had been deliberately done. She told him about 6 months of living in the Grimwater territory and learning its geography and its spirit agreements and what it felt like to live somewhere that told her the truth. He listened the entire time without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "He stole 5 years from us." "He stole 5 years from me," she corrected, gentle but exact. "You gave them to him." He received this without argument, which was the only appropriate response, and she noted it. "I know," he said. "I know what I did. I'm not asking you to keep knowing it. I'm asking you to have known it. There's a difference." He turned to look at her then, the full attention of it. "What is the difference?" "One is carrying it forever," she said. "The other is carrying it long enough to change and then setting it down." The blood moon moved past Meridian, beginning its slow descent. Below the ridge, she could hear the pack settling, the quiet sounds of the assembly dispersing, couples and families moving back toward the village through the dark trees. Doreen's voice carried briefly, something efficient and factual, as was her mode, and then was gone. She was going to go back to Rayeth. Not to stay, but to close the alliance properly, to introduce Callum to the Grimwater's guardian, and begin the process of establishing a formal arrangement between Korok territory and the wetlands' resident entities. It was the right thing to do, and she was the only person in the pack with the knowledge to do it. That was going to take months, and it was going to require her making decisions in her own right, under her own authority. She was going to need a seat on the ruling council that did not exist yet, because the structure that had produced Voss needed replacing, and she had spent 6 months thinking about what she'd replace it with. She was going to take Callum back. Not tonight, and not on the premise that the mate bond made it automatic or required. On the premise that he was the specific frequency that answered hers, and that he had stood in the stone circle and not looked at her, and that those 2 facts existed simultaneously and did not cancel each other out, and that she was woman enough to hold both of them without collapsing into either. She pressed her shoulder against his more firmly. She felt him exhale, the specific exhale of someone who has been holding a breath long enough to forget they were holding it. "What are you reading?" she said. He looked at her, startled. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a way she recognized from 19 years ago and had been afraid she'd never see again. "Still the same page," he said. I've been rereading it for 5 years. Then we'll start from the beginning, she said. I know the stars better now. I can show you how to navigate. The blood moon sat on the horizon, enormous and red and complete, doing exactly what it had always done, answering the things that had finally learned to ask in the right language. Below it, the Korake territory spread out in dark trees and distant lights, a pack in the process of becoming something better than it had been, because one woman had gone into the territory it feared and come back with the truth tucked inside her bones. Mara Dunn stood on the high ridge in the red moonlight and felt the mate bond sing between her and the man beside her. Not the ceremonial register, not the ritual closure, but the real one, the fundamental design. Two frequencies that were made to answer each other, doing exactly that, finally, on her terms, in her time, after everything it had cost both of them to get here. She had howled at the blood moon alone for 5 years. On the 6th, he had finally heard her, not because she had changed, because she had gone somewhere quiet enough to become precisely, entirely, undeniably herself, and that self was something the moon had always been willing to answer, and that Callum Ashford had always, somewhere beneath the 5 years of silence, been made to hear.